With that, we are ready to proceed with the state's opening.
Thank you, Judge. May it please the court, counsel.
And counsel, I'm just going to make this statement for everyone's benefit. I do not mind if you use the portable podium. However, if at any point any juror cannot hear, you need to tell me and I will make the lawyer stand in front of a microphone, okay? So what's most important to me is that you hear. At any point you can't hear, you raise your hand and I will make them stand in front of a microphone. Thank you.
This is a case about a documented Mexican mafia gang member who had such little regard for life and law enforcement that he shot a DPS trooper dead in the face within less than a foot simply for the reason he did not want him to know who he was. He also did this in front of a documented fellow gang member of the Mexican mafia. And in that world, in his world, that is the ultimate act of violence and prestige. He wasn't done then. As two responding troopers were over the body of the man who was slowly bleeding after being shot by the defendant, the car that he was in came back around as they were rendering aid. He wasn't done. He shot again at the trooper that lay bleeding on the ground with the gunshot wound to the face and the two responding officers. We are all here because of Ramon Bueno. And in spite of him, Trooper James Casey, Ronaldo Cruz, Mike Alfano, they survived and they are here. And they will tell you exactly what happened that night. On October 8th of 2014 at approximately 3:06 a.m., Officer James Casey was on routine patrol for the Arizona Department of Public Safety. He was in the area of Indian School in the I-17. Now, at that point in his public service career, he had already served 4 years in the Air Force, 8 years as a city cop back in Massachusetts, and nearly 10 years at the Arizona Department of Public Safety. He was riding alone in his marked vehicle, fully uniformed. At that time, he came off of the I-17 and was going to turn back around on Indian School Road when a vehicle caught his attention. It was a 2008 blue Mercury Sable, and he could tell immediately that there was a window tint violation. The tint was way too dark. Now, instead of immediately turning his lights on, he waited to see if they went onto the I-17, and they did. He went straight ahead, not to spook them and to gather more information. The car got onto the I-17 southbound from Indian School Road, and Officer Casey then got behind the vehicle as it headed southbound. He ran the license plate. It was a Kansas license plate. He called it into dispatch. And he also called for backup. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, on that same night, the defendant was in the car. He lived in a different world. He was a well-known member of the Arizona Mexican Mafia, and he went by the street name of Mono, M-O-N-O. And he wasn't alone. He was with another member of the Arizona Mexican Mafia, Danny Vargas. Now, Danny Vargas, he also had a street name or a moniker, and he went by Lil Sinner, L-I-L. That's who he ran with. And that night, before the car stopped, you'll hear that the defendant also had his girlfriend with him, Valerie Jaime. She had a street name, traviesa, or trouble. Now, to back up, before we get to the car stop, let's talk about what happened that night. The defendant didn't have a job, he didn't have a car. He was running with Danny. He was running with his girlfriend, Valeria. And Danny called over to a woman and asked her for a ride in the area of 23rd Avenue and Indian School. She couldn't go because she had some family issue with a daughter having a baby, but she knew a girl by the name of Lori Richardson who was around. Lori Richardson knew another associate of the defendants, Vanessa Martinez. And Lori and Vanessa agreed to give Danny, Valeria, and the defendant a ride. Lori was driving her blue Sable. She picked up the defendant and the other two, along with Vanessa, in the area of 23rd Avenue and Indian School. Now, where everyone was seated in the car is going to be critical in this case. Lori was driving. Vanessa was in the front passenger seat. In the rear driver's side, the defendant sat. In the middle seat in the back seat was Valeria. Behind the passenger front seat was Danny Vargas, little sinner. Now, going back to where I left off. Officer James Casey has turned on his lights. They're going southbound on the I-17. Lori pulls the car over, and she pulls right into the parking lot at the Knights Inn, which is at McDowell Road and the I-17 on the frontage road there, right next to adult entertainment, Jaguars. So they're in the front of the Knights Inn. The plate was run, the information was logged in. Officer Casey will tell you his spidey sense kicked in. You will hear from his colleague, Officer Cruz. Casey never called for backup. He did that night. He walked up, he looked in, the front passenger window was up, the back passenger window was up, the driver's window was down where Lori was, and the window behind her was put down also. He asked for license and registration and identification. He had put out over the radio he was going to run everyone for warrants. There were 5 occupants in the vehicle. He got a license, driver's license from Lori. He got a driver's license from Vanessa. But the 3 in the back seat, the 2 with the defendant, they didn't provide identification. So what did James Casey do? He took out his notepad, and at this point, he had gone back, and he had a notepad with him, and he said to the 3 in the back, all right, write it down. Give me your name, Social Security, DOB. He'll tell you that the behavior of the defendant, the man behind Lori, and the woman in the back seat was sketchy. It concerned him. They were moving around. They were the only 2 in the car that really were catching his attention. On the notepad, I'll show you. He had Mono, he had a little sinner, Valeria, his girlfriend, in the car, sitting next to him. Lori in the front, Vanessa in the front, in the black Sable, blue Sable. On that notepad, the defendant writes down Johnny Ruiz. Valerie gives her real name. Danny doesn't. Another known alias Danny goes by, Richard Aguilar. He gives that. Now at this point, you will hear that Trooper Ronaldo Cruz was on scene. Trooper Mike Alfano was on scene. and they were there at the vehicle. But they couldn't see in where they were standing from their vantage points. Casey went back to the car and he engaged with the defendant who was right behind the driver's seat. And he said, listen, something along the lines of, you're going to give me your real name or we'll do it the hard way. And he'll tell you essentially what he said. He'll tell you that Danny Vargas was leaning up and he could see his hands against the rear passenger window. He wasn't as concerned about Danny. You'll hear that Ronaldo Cruz had expertise in firearms from his Marine Corps experience. You also hear that Ronaldo Cruz, who was there as backup, was trained in emergency medical care from his combat zone training in the Marine Corps. And this would prove critical that night regarding the saving of Officer Casey's life. You will hear that when the officer was back running the information, the defendant made the statement, "I'm not going in," something to that effect. And when Trooper Casey went back to the car, he started to engage with him again. Fortuitously, he canted his head a little bit and looked down at his notepad, and it was at that point that Ronaldo Cruz, Officer Cruz will tell you, he saw the muzzle flash near Officer Casey's face, and Officer Casey immediately went down. You'll hear that the defendant started ordering the driver to drive. Officer Cruz and Officer Alfano started shooting toward the back rear of the car. Now, what Lori, the driver, and the defendant didn't know at that time was in that nightstand parking lot when they immediately took a right, there was no way out. It was a walled-in perimeter around the hotel. So as Officer Cruz is over the body of James Casey, screaming his name, "Can you hear me? Can you hear me?" 32 seconds goes by. You'll hear this over the radio. Mike Alfano is there also. He hears the screeching of tires, Ronaldo Cruz, and he looks up, and as the blue Sable is going by them again, from the rear passenger side, they're being shot at again, and they return fire. You'll hear Ronaldo Cruz tell you he had to quickly leave James Casey, retreat back, and go back, and then they body dragged James Casey behind an area for cover. They did not know if the shooter was going to come back a third time. Lori Richardson drove a few miles away into a secluded industrial area with railroad tracks. The defendant and Danny Vargas get out. Now remember, this is late at night, a little past 3 a.m. Danny had been shot in the back. Valeria Jaime had been shot in the arm. Danny and the defendant got out. You'll see video footage from a train that had been there at the railroad tracks from the Union Pacific Railroad in the area of 27th Avenue and Jackson Street. You can't see their faces. But there are two men who are getting out of the vehicle and running from the car. Investigators found a bloody shirt in that area based upon follow-up interviews with individuals. DNA came back to Danny Vargas, as the witnesses said. Also near that railroad scene where the defendant got out, you will hear that the police found 4 .357 Magnum unspent casings, shell casings, or unfired bullets in common terms. Now the three women left in the car: Valeria Jaime, Lori Richardson, Vanessa Martinez. They dumped the 2008 Mercury Sable in an abandoned house. They then spent the night at a metal scrapyard trying to figure out what to do. Valeria went back and got some items out of the back of the trunk of one of the men that lived there. No one that night that was in the car contacted the police. Now the next day, Lori Richardson, the one who did not have a relationship with gangs or personal relationship, she went and turned herself into the police. She really was the only person in the car that night that the defendant could not control. Valeria Jaime was the girlfriend, Danny was a fellow gang member. You will hear from a gang expert in this trial that Mexican Mafia members do not snitch in their terms against other Mexican Mafia members. Those are their terms. Now, Lori Richardson gave an interview to the investigators in this case. She gave multiple interviews. She was not forthright right away. She will tell you she was scared. She will tell you she was scared of the defendant, what she had just seen him do. She was scared of others involved. She was scared of the Arizona Mexican Mafia and their gang ties. Did not want to identify anyone involved. You will hear that Lori agreed to testify here in trial. She was prosecuted for lying in those initial interviews. And that she has a testimonial agreement, and she needs to come in and tell you what happened and answer your questions, not just the questions from the attorneys. Lori will tell you that Ramon Bueno was the only one in the car with a gun that night. She will tell you that the defendant said, "I'm not going in." You will also hear that there was great follow-up by the detectives in this case. Every person in that car on the night, where Officer Cruz, Alfano, and Casey were shot at, they were eventually caught and interviewed, all of them. You will hear from William Sunderland, a man who was at the motel, staying at the Night's Inn. He will tell you that the shot from the car first came from the rear passenger side, and that there were no other shots from the car from any other area of the car. And you will hear that this is consistent with the physical evidence in this case. You will hear and see the burn marks on the top of the Mercury Sable from the rear passenger side, the roof, emanating from where those shots were being fired the second time around when they ambushed, or the defendant ambushed the three officers. Consistent with what Lori says, William Sunderland says, and what you will know. There was a week-long manhunt in this case, looking for the defendant, and they knew that Danny Vargas was helping him. Every associate and family member of the defendant was contacted, interviewed, anyone that was willing to be interviewed. There were billboards up around the Phoenix area. There was extensive media coverage. This was a multi-agency, federal, local, state manhunt for the defendant who was hiding. What did they learn? You will also hear that between 3:45 a.m. and 4 a.m. on the night of the shooting, the defendant went to the home of a man that he knows of by the name of Johnny Ray Garcia. He was not law enforcement friendly. Understated. Johnny lived at 825 South 30th Avenue, and he borrowed clothes from Johnny Garcia. He switched them out, and he borrowed his bike. You will also hear that the defendant, after getting those clothes from Johnny's house, went down to the Cold Air Cafe at 2905 West Buckeye Road. And there was surveillance video of the defendant there. and you'll see that, those still images from the surveillance video. Now, on October 15th of 2014, 1 week after this attempted murder, the defendant and Danny Vargas were arrested and taken into custody. They were together at a home of a fellow Mexican mafia associate. When interviewed and after being read his Miranda rights, what did the defendant say? When asked where he was staying, he said, everywhere. And you'll have the opportunity to see his demeanor, his attitude, and I think that will be important to you. When asked where he was on October 8th of 2014, the night of the crime, he said he could not answer that. And all he would say initially was, I wasn't there. I wasn't there. I wasn't there. He didn't say where the there was. He knew what time it was. He knew what this was about. He then began challenging Detective Jan Butcher of the Phoenix Police Department, telling her the media got it wrong, the cops have got it wrong, and he wanted to debate with her in that interview and tell her, no, there were only 2 people in the back. Only 2 people got shot. There wasn't a third person. Why would he make that statement? You will then hear. He didn't explain how he knew those facts, and then he complained that he was hurt during his arrest, so they immediately took him to the hospital, and within 2.5 hours, the doctors discharged him and they resumed the interview. The defendant said that he watched the news and he believed that the police and the news were wrong, there were only 2 in the back seat, and he wanted to continue to debate. The defendant said that at the time that Officer James Casey was shot, he was not even in Phoenix. He was camping. And that he returned on October 9th. And then he said he was at the casino, and then he was camping, and then he said he wasn't at the casino, he changed his mind once he was confronted with the fact that there might be surveillance cameras at the casino. He then admitted later in the interview to seeing Valeria after she was shot, but he said he didn't know she was shot when he saw her. He was just talking to her. And then he shared that Valeria was probably snitching, but that he still loved her, because he didn't know the status of the interviews at that time. The defendant admitted to changing his appearance, shaving off his goatee after the shooting before he was arrested. When asked who Johnny Ruiz was the first name that was written down on the notepad that he wrote down. He said, oh, that was his cousin. Well, not admitting that he wrote it, he did admit that Johnny Ruiz was his cousin. Or his nephew. When asked about Danny Vargas, the defendant said he didn't even know that Danny Vargas was in the house that he was in when they both got arrested together. You will hear that they do associate. The defendant, after being confronted with still photos and other evidence in this case during the interview, said, whether he is innocent or guilty, quote, my dumbass is caught. When asked what would happen if the investigators found his DNA in the car that he claimed he was not in, when asked about that, and these are his words, not mine, he responded, I'm fucked. You will hear that a laptop found in Lori's car behind the driver's seat had his DNA profile on it. Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear that the defendant absolutely was not going to let James Casey know what his identity was. He was not going to be taken in. He knew that shooting a police officer in front of another Arizona Mexican Mafia gang member was the ultimate in that world. Did it in front of Danny Vargas and others he trusted. He counted on no one talking. He counted on those 3 law enforcement officers not living and bearing testimony to what he did. He counted on his DNA not being in the car. He counted on there being no surveillance videos. And he counted on the fact that he was too slick. He could tell them a story and Jan Butcher would believe it. He did absolutely everything he could to get away with these crimes. At the close of this case, after you've heard and considered all of the evidence, the state is going to ask you to hold the defendant accountable for what he did that night. And tell him by your verdict that he did not get away with it.
Thank you.